Hello. So, in this session, I would like to talk about the revelation of Moses. Um, I kind of want to talk about the difference in covenants, what Moses' message really was, what message he was trying to portray, and what that has to do with us. Um, we know, as far as biblical narrative and biblical text goes, that there seems to be an old covenant and a new covenant. Often contrasted between the law of Moses and the laws of Yeshua in text, saying that even to the point where the way in which Yeshua lived his life was such a contradiction, or rather a confounding living expression, that he had to clarify by saying, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Let's take a step back and look at Moses, right? Moses is a very interesting figure, one of my favorites, actually. Reason being is that in his lifetime, he fully embodied the king, priest, prophet trinity that also is the same trinity that the Godhead functions in, where he spent 40 years as a Kemetic priest, 40 years as a Cushite king, and then 40 years as a Hebrew prophet. So for that, I find Moses fascinating. One of the things that he's accredited with is the creation of, at the very least, the Ten Commandments, but kind of the founder of the whole law structure in the Old Covenant. And the narrative I find very interesting in that we see Moses, he goes up and he spends 40 days with God alone. He comes down with these tablets saying that God wrote these. But before anyone can read those tablets, he gets so angry upon seeing the people worshiping an idol that he smashes them on the ground. He drops them, smashes them, and then has to go back up to create some more tablets. And this time, it doesn't say that God wrote these. It says that really Moses wrote these specific laws. So the laws that we get aren't necessarily the same laws that God initially wrote. Now, why does this matter? In the same way that sin was never God's will, I don't believe law was either. I believe that it's something that was allowed, but not something that was ever actually God's design. And think about that, they weren't really called laws, but rather commandments, meaning that the people were being commanded to live a certain way. I believe that, like many others in history, Moses had access to revelation that he had a hard time articulating. And in the best way that he could, he created some commandments that he could kind of use to possibly shift people into the revelation that he had embraced while spending 40 days straight with God. I Here's a narrative thing that I found interesting, right? Moses 40 years in Kemet, right? Around the statues. 40 years in Cush. Statues still there. So he understands the sciences of the statues. He knows what they actually represent in Kemetic culture versus what we in the modern world think that they were used for. So I find it kind of odd that Moses was angered by the use of statues. We then go a bit further, I believe it's in Numbers, where the people are being bit by venomous serpents, venomous snakes, and the way that he's instructed to heal them is to create a bronze serpent for them to look at. I find it interesting considering he just destroyed tablets because he saw them looking upon a graven image, quote unquote. And that also goes against those same commandments that Moses himself just wrote. Now that begs the question, because it seems like statues isn't the issue. What message is Moses really trying to say? When I teach on the prophetic, I say this, that a prophet isn't just a messenger. They themselves are a message. So what message was Moses? What message was he sent to bring to humanity at that time? What message was he trying to portray? Why the sudden change in attitude upon that moment in relation to statues? This is what I believe. I believe that Moses went up, spent 40 days with God, getting to know the actual will that God has for humanity. So much so, later verses says that Moses came down scary to look at. He came down looking like God, with fire and horns and things like that. You know, you become who you spend time with. So what I believe happened is Moses went up and he accessed the revelation that Yeshua later embodied and also articulated. The issue is that he struggled with articulation, which is that mankind is the image of God itself, that we are the image of God. The scriptures say that we are made in the image of God in the English translation. I find that to be a bit misleading. We're not just made in the image of God, as in we look like God, but we're made as the image of God. That word image, meaning idol, everywhere else in Scripture, I believe it applies here as well. And this is something that if you've been following me for some time or listening to me for some time, you've heard me say before. Genesis 1 is a poem. It's not a narrative, meaning that it's not historically describing the way in which things were created. It's metaphorically drawing or illustrating a picture that the people of that day would recognize. In that each of the days of creation were days in which different things were being dedicated to the temple. Different parts of the temple were being dedicated. And there's something interesting about that seventh day of rest. And that's the day in which the God of the temple would then rest inside of the temple. So typically what they would do is they would build a statue, they would construct an idol to place in the Holy of Holies of that temple to represent the presence of the God now being within that temple. That's the day in which God fashioned man from clay, showing that we're not just in the image of God, as in we look like God, but we're made as the idol of God in the temple that is creation. And this reveals the initial purpose of humanity. Initially, it said that God had made man a little lower than Elohim, mistranslated angel in some translations. This is because we are initially a lesser representation, but a mirror of the triune, biune God. The fullness of God, the fullness of the Godhead expressed into a singular form. Now, why does this matter? I believe that Moses accessed this revelation, realizing that mankind itself is the idol of God, thus making external idol worship null and void and unnecessary. And I believe initially, coming off the mountain, Moses kind of had an unfair reaction, and that he became upset, somewhat forgetting that he was the only one that was spending 40 days with God and the rest of them weren't there. Not only did he come down to see them using an idol, they were misusing an idol. And I believe that was a reaction of his frustration. Two reasons. One, idols aren't to be worshipped. Two, you are the idol. You don't need an external thing. You are the external thing that God made. What's my proof of this? The fact that Moses came back down looking like God. He had begun to embody that revelation. The fire, the smoke, the horns, the glowing, the glory, all those different things as he spent 40 days face to face with God. He began to embody the revelation that mankind is inherently divine, that we were made as the image, as the idol of God, as the divine representation of God to all of creation. And if you begin to look at the different commandments that Moses wrote, they all have to do with living a godly life. The issue is it's outer court rather than innermost court, in that he's teaching people how to get in rather than be. Moses didn't learn what he learned because he was coached, prodded, given laws and rules to live by. That's not the way he accessed that revelation, but that's the way he attempted to teach it. No, Moses got that revelation because he spent intimate time with God, allowing that relationship, allowing that fellowship to transfigure him. As I mentioned before, you become who you spend time with. Your fellowship sculpts you. You are who you spend the most time with. So instead of replicating the same science that caused his transfiguration, he created commandments. Don't kill, don't look at an idol. So they're doing these things, but it really has no purpose to them. So they're doing things with no purpose, doing things with no intimacy. This is the same structure of religion that many of us are just now coming out of, or many of us are still in. This system that is religion itself started here, in the fact that Moses was even going up the mountain alone to begin with. It's the, you know what? I'm going to trust that you heard God. I'm going to believe that however you articulate it is the way that God desired it. And I'm going to surrender wholeheartedly to whatever comes out of your mouth. That structure started here with what I call the man of God, the singular man of God syndrome. And this has permeated throughout many different religions, where there's the idea that one person meets with God and they share what God has for humanity, and no one else goes and asks God. They just believe the man of God. Now, I'll have you know, if you know me or don't, I don't support that structure. I believe everyone can have an intimate relationship with God. Everyone can hear God themselves. And we don't really need anyone else to hear God for us. That's my stance. But this structure here of Moses, you go up the mountain, you meet with God, you come back and tell us what God said, we'll just believe you, is what we've been stuck in. And that is in part due to Moses's poor articulation of the revelation that he had access to. The revelation he accessed was intimacy with God brings you back into who God always created you to be. That you are the image of God. That you are divine. That mankind is meant to be a reflection of the fullness of God. Moses failed to articulate that, thus released a message, thus released a structure, a system that could not bear that revelation, though he himself walked in it. This is how we enter into the law, sin, and death production of one another, where even condemnation even sets in. Now, this gets people into an idea of a form of works, where instead of allowing the authenticity to produce fruit, you're now focused on knocking down fruit off of a tree rather than changing the tree altogether. religions around the world haven't grasped the concept that it doesn't matter how much you beat the fruit off of a tree, it's still going to grow because it's still the same tree. That if you want a different fruit, you have to get another tree. Those who get it, got it. And that type of thinking was the byproduct of Moses' articulation. Is that we can't just be with God as Moses did. We have to do what Moses said. We can't do what he did. We have to do what he said. We can't follow his pattern that he lived. We have to follow the blueprint that he gave us. Now, let's move along a few thousand years to the life of Yeshua. Now, Yeshua came historically. I believe Yeshua was a historical figure. I believe Jesus was made up. Similar story to Apollonius of Tyana. But I'll digress. Yeshua was a historical figure who walked the earth. He manifested the fullness of the Godhead bodily and shared that revelation fluently with those around him, calling them out of sin consciousness, which is separation, revealing to them two things: that you are the temple of God. What does that mean? I am the dwelling place of God. What does that mean? God's inside of me. Why does that matter? That means I can't be separate from God. That in itself is the eradication of sin. What else did he go about teaching people? Ye are gods. The word in the Hebrew being Elohim, that same Elohim that's in Genesis. So now he's not just saying that you're a little lower than Elohim, as scriptures before may have said. He's now calling people up to the same level that God is, saying that the inner reflects the outer reflects the inner. You're the same thing that God is. And that's not Nelson's message alone. I do teach that message, but that's Yeshua's message. Don't you know that ye are gods? Yikes. So, where Moses failed to articulate, Yeshua successfully articulated. That's why, in this context, Yeshua can say, I didn't come to abolish the law per se. I came to fulfill it. How do you fulfill a law? How do you fulfill those commandments? You actually skip the commandments themselves and then articulate what Moses was trying to say all along. What is the thing that Yeshua came physically embodying? Remember, a prophet isn't just a messenger. They are a message. The message that Yeshua lived is that mankind is divine. That man is one with God. I and the Father are one. To see me is to see the Father. That's the message that he embodied. Which, if you look back at Moses, that's the same thing he was walking in, but not the same thing he taught. It's a failure of articulation, which is the danger of getting your revelation from someone other than God, because you've given yourself over to their articulation. Suppose I'm not even doing a good job at sharing this revelation. Yet you take everything that I say at face value and you go off in a path that I really didn't mean for you to go. Whose fault is that? You can say it's mine because I taught it, but I knew what I was trying to say. Or you could take a bit of responsibility and say, I could have just asked God. Because I know all too well God talks back. Audibly, clearly, right? Doesn't have to be left up to the divinations that many of us have grown accustomed to. God can speak clearly. God can speak directly. You can hear the Father. You can talk with the Father. You can talk with Holy Spirit. They talk back. So if I was to share this revelation of Moses, what is it? Well, it's the same revelation of Yeshua. That you are one with God. God lives in you. You are God. You are divine. Relationship with God transfigures you. Fellowship with God transfigures you. Transfiguration is found in your fellowship. This is why we shouldn't forsake the assembly of the brethren. Does that mean we all need to go to church? No, silly. None of them in that verse. No one in the Bible went to church. But all of them fellowshipped. The churches that we think of weren't created for several hundred years later. Several hundred years later. No, that word ecclesia, that's a governing body. Why would they call a bunch of gods gathered together, a bunch of sons, a bunch of spiritual people gathered together, a governing body? Remember the words of Yeshua. Don't you know that ye are gods? That word gods, that word Elohim also means judges. They are the deciders. We are the deciders. Those who decide, those who make the final decision, those who sculpt the course of history, those who decide what's going to take place. Those who decide what's allowed in, what's not allowed, what's allowed out. The governing body is what they were. It was a community, a constantly fellowshipping, living, breathing community of people who were walking in their godhood, walking in their sonship, living in fellowship with heaven on earth. Which is why it was easier for them to believe that Peter's angel had came to dinner rather than that Peter got out of jail. Because heaven was not foreign, because they were living in fellowship with divine things. They were living in regular fellowship with heaven. This is the same revelation that we're all called to embody, because the revelation applies to us all. You're God whether you know it or not. You're divine whether you want to believe it or not. You are what God is whether you know it or not, simply because you're a child of God. No child is something different than what the parents are genetically. They might choose a different profession, but they can't choose to be something different. No matter how they act. If two giraffes have a kid, it's a giraffe, even if it tries to act like something else. Two dogs, hey, it's puppies. It's still a dog. Even if that dog later on grows up raised by cats, it's still a dog. Same with us. That is, God is our family. God is our parent. That makes us the same thing that God is. And that's the revelation that Yeshua came to share. That's the revelation that Moses was trying to share. And truthfully, the journey that we undergo in humanity is our personal embracing of that message. Our personal realization, our personal revelation. And that's what I believe Yeshua's whole mission was. Yeshua didn't show up teaching anything new. There were people long before him, even contemporaries with him, who were doing the things that he did. So what made him special? What was his actual mission? To remind all of humanity what they were. It was an identity mission. They had people doing things to reach their godhood rather than simply being a child of God. Be born again. Well, if you're born, you instantly start off as a baby. You're a child. Subtle language says, be a child of God. It says no one comes to the Father except through me. Well, what is he? He's the way. Well, what is that? What is the way? The offspring. It's the Son. You only access God by being his kid. Otherwise, the king has no reason to meet with you. But fathers meet with their children. I'll leave that here. I don't want to ramble on for too long. But that is the revelation of Moses. That is the revelation of Yeshua. That is the revelation that we're all called to embody. You are divine. You can have fellowship with God. Fellowship is your medicine. Later.